The world spun violently around me as I collapsed in the sterile hallway of Riverside Medical Center's balance disorder clinic. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Derek's voice, cold and distant, telling the receptionist he had an urgent business meeting and couldn't wait around for whatever dramatic episode his wife was having this time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. When I regained consciousness, 20 minutes later, nurses were checking my vitals, and my husband was nowhere to be found. What I didn't know then was that Dr. Marcus Bennett had been quietly documenting every symptom, every dizzy spell, every unexplained episode that had brought me to his clinic over the past 6 months. And what Derek definitely didn't know was that the blood work he'd been so eager for me to skip was about to reveal the shocking truth behind my mysterious illness. The morning started like so many others had in recent months, with me gripping the bathroom counter as waves of dizziness crashed over me like an invisible tide. My reflection in the mirror looked pale and hollow, dark circles shadowing eyes that had once sparkled with life. The woman staring back at me seemed like a stranger, fragile and uncertain in ways I'd never been before. "Nat, you ready?" Derek's voice carried an edge of impatience from downstairs. "We need to leave in 5 minutes if we're going to make your appointment." I steadied myself against the wall, taking slow, deliberate breaths the way Dr. Bennett had taught me during my first visit to the balance disorder clinic 3 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that my husband, who had initially dismissed my symptoms as stress or female hysteria, was now the one insisting I keep every medical appointment religiously. The drive to Riverside Medical Center was tense and quiet. Derek's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he navigated through Cedar Falls morning traffic, his jaw set in that familiar expression of barely contained irritation. I'd grown accustomed to that look over the past year, the way his features would harden whenever my health issues interfered with his carefully ordered world. "Dr. Bennett mentioned wanting to run some additional tests today," I said softly, hoping to fill the oppressive silence between us. Derek's grip tightened on the wheel. "More tests? How many tests does it take to figure out you're having balance problems?" "This is getting ridiculous, Natalie." His dismissive tone stung, but not as much as it once would have. Somewhere along the way, I developed a protective numbness to his casual cruelty, a defense mechanism that allowed me to function despite the constant undercurrent of his disapproval. We pulled into the medical center's parking garage, and Derek's phone immediately buzzed with what seemed like an urgent message. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that looked almost like anticipation. "Actually, I just remembered I have a conference call with the Morrison account at 10, he said, not meeting my eyes. "You'll be fine going in alone, right? These appointments usually take forever anyway." The lie came so smoothly that I almost didn't catch it. Almost. But Derek had never mentioned any Morrison account before, and his sudden eagerness to abandon me at the clinic felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "I thought you cleared your schedule for this," I said, studying his profile as he stared intently at his phone screen. "Business doesn't stop because you're having dizzy spells, Nat. Some of us have responsibilities." The words were sharp, designed to cut, and they succeeded. I gathered my purse and the folder of medical records I'd been meticulously maintaining, documenting every episode, every symptom, every detail that might help Dr. Bennett understand what was happening to my body. The folder had become my lifeline, proof that I wasn't imagining the vertigo, the nausea, the moments when the world would tilt and blur around me without warning. "I'll call you when I'm done," I said, opening the car door. "Take your time," Derek replied, already dialing a number. "I'll probably be tied up most of the day anyway." The clinical smell of antiseptic and floor wax greeted me as I entered the medical center's lobby. Riverside had always felt more welcoming than most hospitals, with its warm lighting and carefully chosen artwork. But today, even its comfortable atmosphere couldn't ease the growing sense of unease that had been building in my chest. Linda Park, the nurse who had become familiar with my frequent visits, smiled warmly as I approached the reception desk for the balance disorder clinic. Her genuine concern had been one of the few bright spots in this medical odyssey, a reminder that not everyone viewed my symptoms with skepticism or impatience. "Good morning, Natalie. How are you feeling today?" Linda's question carried real interest, not the perfunctory politeness I'd grown used to from medical staff. About the same, I admitted. Maybe a little worse. The episodes seemed to be getting more frequent. Something flickered across Linda's expression, a flash of concern that she quickly masked with professional composure. Dr. Bennett will want to hear about that. He's been reviewing your case file extensively. The waiting area was nearly empty at this early morning hour, just an elderly man reading a newspaper and a middle-aged woman nervously checking her watch. I settled into a chair near the window, trying to focus on the view of Cedar Falls' downtown skyline, rather than the persistent feeling that something fundamental was shifting in my world. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Grace, checking in as she had every day since my symptoms had worsened. Grace lived 3 hours away in Portland, but she'd been more present and supportive than my own husband throughout this entire ordeal. "How's the appointment going?" "Thinking of you today," her message read. I typed back quickly, "Just arrived. Derek had to leave for work, but I'm okay." Grace's response came immediately. "He left you there alone? Again?" "Nat, that's not normal." Before I could respond, Linda called my name, and I followed her down the familiar hallway to Dr. Bennett's office. The neurologist was younger than I'd expected when I first met him, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of listening that made me feel heard rather than dismissed. "Natalie, please have a seat," Dr. Bennett said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His expression was more serious than usual, and I noticed several additional folders spread across his workspace alongside my chart. "I've been reviewing your case extensively since our last visit," he began, removing his glasses to clean them with methodical precision. "The pattern of your symptoms, the timing of their onset, the specific nature of your balance issues, it's all very interesting from a medical standpoint." "Interesting how?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk between us. "Natalie, I need to ask you some questions that might seem unusual, but I want you to know that anything you tell me is completely confidential. You're safe here." The word safe sent an unexpected chill through me. Why would he need to emphasize safety in a medical context? "Of course," I said, though my voice sounded smaller than I intended. "Have you noticed any correlation between your symptoms and specific activities, foods, or times of day?" His question was careful, deliberate. I thought about it, pulling out my symptom journal to reference the detailed notes I'd been keeping. "They seem worse in the evenings, usually after dinner. And they've been getting progressively worse over the past 6 months." Dr. Bennett made a note in my file. "What about your morning routine? Do you take any vitamins, supplements, or medications regularly?" "Just the multivitamin Derek bought for me about 8 months ago. He said I looked tired and thought it might help with my energy levels." The memory felt oddly significant as I spoke it aloud. "And when did your symptoms first begin?" I flipped through my journal, though I already knew the answer. "About 7 months ago. It started with just occasional dizziness, but it's gotten so much worse." Dr. Bennett exchanged a meaningful look with Linda, who had remained in the room during our conversation. Something passed between them, a silent communication that made my pulse quicken. "Natalie, I'd like to run some additional blood work today. More comprehensive than what we've done before." Dr. Bennett's tone was gentle but firm. "I want to test for some specific substances that might be causing your symptoms." "What kind of substances?" He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "There are certain toxins, both organic and synthetic, that can cause the exact constellation of symptoms you've been experiencing. The progressive nature of your condition, combined with the specific pattern of when your symptoms occur, suggests we should explore this possibility." The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. "Are you saying someone might be poisoning me?" "I'm saying we need to rule it out," Dr. Bennett replied diplomatically. "It's probably nothing, but as your doctor, I have a responsibility to investigate all possibilities." Linda stepped forward with a gentle smile. "We'll take care of everything today, Natalie. The blood work won't take long, and we should have preliminary results by this afternoon." As Linda prepared the vials for blood collection, my mind raced through the implications of what Dr. Bennett was suggesting. The timing of Derek's new attentiveness to my medical appointments, his insistence that I take the vitamins he'd purchased, his sudden business emergencies whenever tests were scheduled, details that had seemed merely annoying began to form a darker pattern. "Dr. Bennett," I said as Linda finished drawing my blood, "if someone were doing this deliberately, how would you prove it?" His expression grew grave. "The blood work will show us if there are any foreign substances in your system. If we find something, we'll need to determine the source and document everything carefully. This is why I want you to know that you're safe here, Natalie. Whatever we discover, we'll handle it properly." I left the clinic that morning with more questions than answers, but also with something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Not just hope for a diagnosis, but hope that the fog of confusion and self-doubt that had surrounded my illness might finally be lifting.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Derek was conspicuously absent when I called him from the parking garage, his phone going straight to voicemail. The message I left was simple: finished with the appointment. Dr. Bennett ran some additional tests. I'll take a cab home. The taxi ride through Cedar Falls gave me time to think, to process the morning's revelations and the growing certainty that my marriage was not what I'd believed it to be. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, noticed my distress and offered gentle conversation about the changing seasons and the beauty of Oregon's autumn colors. "You doing okay, miss?" he asked as we pulled into my driveway in Maplewood Heights. "You look like you've had quite a day." "I'm starting to think I have," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. As I stood on my front porch, keys in hand, I realized that whatever Dr. Bennett's tests revealed, there was no going back to the woman I'd been that morning. The seeds of suspicion had been planted, and they were already beginning to grow into something that looked remarkably like courage. Inside my house, everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left that morning, but somehow it all felt different. The kitchen where Derek had made my coffee, the cabinet where he stored my vitamins, the dining room where we shared our evening meals, every familiar space now carried the weight of possibility and doubt. I found myself drawn to Derek's home office, a space I rarely entered without invitation. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see his desk with its neat stacks of papers, and his computer in sleep mode. For the first time in our 5-year marriage, I wondered what secrets that room might hold. But instead of crossing that threshold, I went upstairs to our bedroom and sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the framed photo on Derek's nightstand. It showed us on our wedding day, young and smiling, full of hope for the future we were going to build together. The woman in that photo looked so confident, so trusting, so completely unaware of the journey that lay ahead. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. Grace's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a relief I hadn't expected to feel. "How did the appointment go?" my sister asked immediately. "I've been thinking about you all morning." "Grace," I said, and something in my voice must have alarmed her because she immediately became more alert. "What happened? Is it serious?" I looked around the bedroom I'd shared with Derek for 5 years, at the life we'd built together, at the future I'd thought we were working toward. Then I took a deep breath and began to tell my sister about Dr. Bennett's suspicions, about the blood tests, about the pattern of symptoms that might not be random after all. "Oh my God, Natalie," Grace whispered when I finished. "You need to get out of there. You need to come stay with me until you know what's going on." "I can't just leave based on suspicions," I protested, though even as I said it, I knew I was trying to convince myself as much as her. "If there's even a chance that Derek is hurting you, you can't stay there," Grace insisted. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't eat or drink anything he gives you until you know for sure." I promised, and after we hung up, I sat in the growing afternoon shadows of my bedroom, waiting for test results that would either restore my faith in my marriage or shatter my world completely. The house felt different around me, no longer the safe haven it had once been, but not yet the crime scene it might become. I was suspended between two realities, waiting for science to tell me which one was true. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of suburban life continuing unchanged. Children playing, lawnmowers running, neighbors going about their daily routines. But inside my house, inside my marriage, inside my very body, everything had already begun to shift in ways that could never be undone. The woman who had entered Riverside Medical Center that morning had been a patient seeking answers to a medical mystery. The woman who sat waiting for those answers was beginning to understand that some mysteries, once solved, change everything you thought you knew about your life. And somewhere across town, Derek was going about his day, completely unaware that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble under the weight of scientific evidence and the growing strength of a wife he had underestimated. The call came at 4:30 that afternoon while I was sitting in our kitchen, staring at the bottle of multivitamins Derek had bought me 8 months earlier. The innocent-looking brown bottle sat on the counter like a silent accusation, its cheerful label promising enhanced energy and vitality. I'd been holding it for the better part of an hour, turning it over in my hands, reading the ingredients list with new eyes. "Mrs. Hayes?" Dr. Bennett's voice was carefully controlled when I answered the phone. "Could you come back to the clinic this evening? I have your test results, and I think we need to discuss them in person." The gravity in his tone sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. "Is it serious?" "I'd prefer to discuss the details when you're here. Would 7 o'clock work? I know it's after regular hours, but I think privacy would be beneficial for this conversation." After hanging up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, the vitamin bottle still clutched in my hands. Derek wouldn't be home until after 8, he'd texted earlier. Another late meeting with clients whose names I'd never heard him mention before. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore now that I was actually looking for it. I called Grace, my voice surprisingly steady as I explained about Dr. Bennett's call and his request for an evening meeting. "I'm driving down," Grace said immediately. "I can be there by 6:30. "You don't need to do that. I can handle a doctor's appointment." "Natalie, stop." Grace's voice carried the authority of an older sister who'd been protecting me since childhood. "If what we suspect is true, you shouldn't be alone right now. I'm already getting my keys." The 2 hours until Grace arrived passed in a strange, suspended state. I found myself moving through my house like a detective, seeing familiar objects with new eyes. The coffee maker Derek used every morning to make my cup with extra care. The special dinner plates he'd bought last spring, insisting we needed something more elegant for entertaining guests who never seemed to come. The herb garden he'd planted outside the kitchen window, tending it with an enthusiasm that had surprised me at the time. When Grace's car pulled into the driveway, I felt a relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. My sister stepped out looking fierce and determined, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, her jacket zipped up against the cooling evening air. She'd always been the stronger one between us, the one who questioned authority and trusted her instincts, while I'd spent my life trying to keep the peace and make everyone comfortable. "How are you holding up?" she asked, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her familiar lavender perfume and the coffee she'd clearly consumed during the drive. "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep thinking there has to be some other explanation. This morning I was a wife with a balance disorder. Tonight I might be something else entirely." Grace held me at arm's length, studying my face with the intensity she'd always brought to problems that needed solving. "Whatever Dr. Bennett tells us, we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this." The drive to Riverside Medical Center felt different in the evening darkness. The building's windows glowed warmly against the night sky, but the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered cars belonging to night shift staff. Grace insisted on coming inside with me, and I was grateful for her steady presence as we made our way to the balance disorder clinic. Linda Park was waiting for us at the reception desk, her usual professional demeanor mixed with something that looked like concern and perhaps a touch of anger. She led us down a hallway I'd never seen before, past offices that were dark and empty, to a conference room where Dr. Bennett sat with several thick folders spread across the table. "Natalie, thank you for coming back tonight," Dr. Bennett said, rising to shake hands with both Grace and me. "I wanted to have this conversation somewhere we wouldn't be interrupted." Grace introduced herself as my sister, and I could see Dr. Bennett assessing her presence, clearly pleased that I hadn't come alone. Linda closed the door behind us and took a seat at the table, her expression grim. The blood work came back this afternoon, Dr. Bennett began without preamble. Natalie, you have significant levels of ethylene glycol in your system. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace grabbed my hand under the table, her grip tight and reassuring. I'm not familiar with that, I said, though something deep in my stomach already knew this wasn't going to be good news. Ethylene glycol is the primary component in antifreeze, Dr. Bennett explained gently. It's also found in some industrial solvents and hydraulic brake fluids. It's not something that occurs naturally in the human body. Grace's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. Someone has been poisoning her. Dr. Bennett nodded gravely. The levels we found indicate chronic exposure over several months. The symptoms you've been experiencing, the dizziness, nausea, balance problems, they're all consistent with ethylene glycol poisoning. If left untreated, it can cause permanent kidney damage, brain damage, and eventually death. The room seemed to spin around me, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. How long do I have? How much damage has already been done? We caught it in time, Linda said quickly. Your kidney function is still within normal ranges, and we can begin treatment immediately to help your body eliminate the remaining toxin. But Natalie, we need to identify the source of exposure to prevent further poisoning. Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. I have to ask some difficult questions now. Is there anyone in your life who has access to your food, drinks, or medications? Someone who might have reason to want to harm you? The question I'd been dreading hung between us like a loaded weapon. Grace squeezed my hand tighter, and I felt her strength flowing into me. My husband, I whispered. Derek has been very attentive about my vitamins lately. He makes my coffee every morning. He's been insisting I eat dinner at home instead of going out with friends. Dr. Bennett and Linda exchanged a look that confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. This wasn't their first case of domestic poisoning. Natalie, drive, Bennett said carefully. Have you brought those vitamins with you? I pulled the bottle from my purse, setting it on the table like evidence in a trial. Dr. Bennett put on latex gloves before picking it up, examining the label and the pills inside with practiced attention. We'll need to test these, he said. Linda will handle that immediately. In the meantime, I need you to understand that you cannot return home tonight. If our suspicions are correct, you're in immediate physical danger. Grace was already nodding. She's coming home with me to Portland tonight. That's a good start, Dr. Bennett agreed, but we also need to involve law enforcement. What we've discovered constitutes attempted murder, and it needs to be reported. The word murder hit me like a physical blow. Murder. Derek, the man I'd pledged my life to, the man who'd held me when I cried, who'd promised to love and protect me, had been slowly killing me for months. I need to call Detective Coleman, Linda said, already reaching for her phone. He handles cases like this for the Cedar Falls Police Department. Cases like this? I asked weakly. This has happened before? More often than you'd think, Dr. Bennett said sadly. Domestic poisoning often goes undetected because the symptoms mimic so many other conditions. Victims are usually women, and the perpetrators are typically intimate partners who have daily access to their food and drink. Over the next hour, as we waited for Detective Coleman to arrive, Dr. Bennett explained the treatment protocol that would help my body recover from months of systematic poisoning. Linda tested the vitamins using a portable kit she retrieved from the clinic's lab, confirming what we all already knew: they were contaminated with ethylene glycol. The pills have been hollowed out and refilled, Linda explained, showing us the evidence under a magnifying glass. It's a sophisticated method that requires planning and knowledge of the substance's effects. Detective Ray Coleman arrived just after 9 o'clock, a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair, and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen too much human cruelty to be shocked by anything. He listened to Dr. Bennett's findings with the focused attention of a professional, taking careful notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of my symptoms. Mrs. Hayes, Detective Coleman said when Dr. Bennett had finished his presentation, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband's recent behavior. Has he shown any signs of unusual stress, financial problems, or relationship issues? I thought about Derek's increasing irritability over the past year, his secretive phone calls, his sudden concern for my health that had seemed so caring at the time but now felt sinister and calculated. He's been different, I admitted. More controlling about what I eat and drink, more insistent that I stay home instead of going out with friends. He always has an excuse for why he can't come to my medical appointments, but he's very interested in the results afterward. Grace spoke up from beside me. He's isolated her from her support system. I live 3 hours away, and he's made it increasingly difficult for us to visit each other. He always has some reason why it's not a good time. Detective Coleman nodded, as if this fit a familiar pattern. What about life insurance, Mrs. Hayes? Has your husband recently increased your policy or taken out any new coverage? The question sent ice through my veins. He mentioned something about updating our policies a few months ago. Said it was smart financial planning now that we're getting older. We'll need to verify that, Detective Coleman said, making another note. Dr. Bennett, how quickly would the poisoning have been fatal if left untreated? Based on the levels we found and the progression of symptoms, I'd estimate another 2 to 3 months before permanent organ damage became irreversible. Death would likely have followed within 6 months to a year. The clinical assessment of my own mortality felt surreal, like we were discussing someone else's case rather than my life. Grace's hand in mine was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. What happens now? I asked. Detective Coleman closed his notebook and looked at me with something like compassion. Now we build a case. We'll need to search your home for evidence, the antifreeze source, any containers that might have been used to prepare the contaminated vitamins, computer records of research into poisoning methods. Dr. Bennett's medical findings and the contaminated pills give us probable cause for a search warrant. Derek will be home soon, I realized with growing panic. He's expecting me to be there. He can't know that we've discovered the poisoning, Detective Coleman said firmly. If he realizes we're onto him, he might destroy evidence or become dangerous in other ways. Dr. Bennett, can you admit Mrs. Hayes to the hospital tonight for observation and treatment? That gives us a legitimate reason for her absence while we execute the search warrant. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and legal preparations. I was admitted to Riverside Medical Center's toxicology unit, where nurses began the process of chelation therapy to help remove the remaining poison from my system. Grace stayed with me throughout the night, holding my hand as the reality of what Derek had done slowly sank in. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Where are you? Your car's not in the garage. Grace helped me craft a response that wouldn't raise suspicion. At the hospital. Had a bad episode at the clinic, and Dr. Bennett wanted to monitor me overnight. I'll call you in the morning. Derek's reply came quickly. Do you need me to come? I can leave the office if it's serious. The false concern in his message made my stomach turn. No need, just routine observation. Get some sleep. Love you, came his final message of the night, and I stared at those 2 words for a long time, trying to reconcile them with the bottles of contaminated vitamins sitting in the police evidence lab across town. Grace slept fitfully in the chair beside my hospital bed, waking frequently to check on me with the protective instincts of someone who'd almost lost her sister to a monster disguised as a loving husband. In the quiet hours of the night, as medication flowed through my IV to counteract months of deliberate poisoning, I began to understand that the woman I'd been that morning, trusting, accommodating, eager to please, was gone forever. The dawn brought Detective Coleman with a briefcase full of evidence, and a grim expression that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. We executed the search warrant at 6 this morning, he reported, setting his briefcase on my hospital bed table. Your husband wasn't there. According to his office, he never came in yesterday after leaving you at the clinic. Grace sat up straighter in her chair. Where is he? We're trying to determine that. But, Mrs. Hayes, what we found in your house confirms everything Dr. Bennett suspected. Detective Coleman opened his briefcase and began laying out photographs and evidence bags. Hidden in your husband's workshop in the basement, we found containers of ethylene glycol, empty vitamin capsules, and a syringe that tested positive for the same substance found in your blood. The photographs showed Derek's workbench, normally used for his weekend carpentry projects, transformed into what looked like a chemistry lab. Bottles of antifreeze sat next to precision measuring tools and boxes of empty gel capsules that matched the vitamins I'd been taking faithfully every morning. "There's more," Detective Coleman continued. "We found his computer browser history showing extensive research into undetectable poisons, symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning, and how long it takes for the substance to cause fatal organ damage." Grace made a sound of disgust. "He was researching how to kill her. The most damning evidence is this," Detective Coleman said, pulling out a printed document. "A life insurance policy he took out on you 8 months ago, Mrs. Hayes. $500,000 with double indemnity for accidental death." The timeline aligned perfectly with the start of my symptoms and Derek's sudden interest in my health and nutrition. Everything had been calculated, planned, executed, with the patience of someone who saw murder as a long-term investment strategy. "He's been planning this for almost a year," I whispered, staring at the policy documents that valued my life at $500,000. "We also found evidence that he's been having an affair," Detective Coleman added gently. "Text messages and emails with a woman named Crystal Martinez. They've been discussing their future together once he's, quote, free from his current obligations." The betrayal felt abstract compared to the attempted murder, like a minor injury when you're already bleeding from a major wound. Derek hadn't just been trying to kill me. He'd been planning a whole new life with another woman, financed by my death. Dr. Bennett arrived during the afternoon with test results showing that the chelation therapy was working effectively. My body was already beginning to eliminate the accumulated toxins, and my kidney function remained stable. "How long before I feel normal again?" I asked. "Physically, you should see significant improvement within a few weeks," Dr. Bennett explained. "The dizziness and balance problems should resolve as the poison clears your system. But emotionally and psychologically, recovery from this kind of trauma takes much longer." He was right. Even as my body began to heal, my mind struggled to process the magnitude of Derek's betrayal. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was premeditated, methodical, patient evil, disguised as marital devotion. That evening, Grace helped me review the evidence Detective Coleman had collected, preparing me for the legal proceedings that lay ahead. The photographs of Derek's makeshift laboratory, the browser history documenting his research into murder methods, the insurance policies and love letters to another woman. Together, they painted a picture of a man I'd never really known at all. How did I live with him for 5 years and never see what he really was? I asked Grace as we sat in the hospital rooms gathering darkness. "Because he didn't want you to see," Grace replied simply. "Psychopaths are excellent at wearing masks, at showing people exactly what they want to see. You fell in love with the mask, not the monster underneath." The nurses had dimmed the lights for the evening when my phone rang with an unknown number. Grace answered it cautiously, then handed it to me with a meaningful look. "Natalie?" Derek's voice sounded strained, desperate. "I heard you were in the hospital. Are you okay?" The irony of his concern would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. "I'm fine, Derek. Where are you?" "I had to leave town suddenly for work. A client emergency. But I'm worried about you." "The doctors. What are they saying about your condition?" I looked at Grace, who was already signaling Detective Coleman. They'd been hoping Derek would call, that his narcissism and need for control would overcome his survival instincts. "They're running more tests," I said carefully, "trying to figure out what's been causing my symptoms." There was a pause, and I could almost hear Derek calculating the risks and possibilities. "What kind of tests?" "Blood work, mostly. Very thorough blood work." The silence that followed confirmed what we all already knew. Derek understood that his carefully constructed plan was unraveling, that the slow-acting poison he'd chosen for its subtlety had finally been detected by medical science and legal scrutiny. "Natalie," he said finally, his voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before, "whatever they tell you, remember that I love you. Everything I've done has been because I love you." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone in the darkness, knowing I'd never hear from my husband again. Somewhere out there, Derek was running from the consequences of his actions, leaving behind the life he'd tried to destroy, and the evidence of his methodical cruelty. But I was still here, damaged but alive, betrayed but not broken, poisoned but not defeated. The woman who had trusted blindly was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes requires seeing the world exactly as it is, not as we wish it could be. In the morning, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life from the man who'd tried to steal it. Tonight, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope for a future that was entirely my own. The safe house looked like any other suburban home in Brookstone, with its neat lawn and cheerful yellow shutters, but I knew that somewhere inside its ordinary walls were security cameras, panic buttons, and reinforced doors designed to keep dangerous men like Derek from reaching their intended victims. Detective Coleman had arranged for me to stay here while the manhunt for my husband continued, and for the first time in months I felt like I could breathe without checking over my shoulder. "This is your room," said Officer Sarah Martinez, leading me down a hallway lined with family photographs of people I'd never met. "The bathroom is right across the hall, and there's a phone by your bed that connects directly to our dispatch center. Press the red button if you need anything at all." Grace had returned to Portland reluctantly, only after I'd convinced her that the witness protection program would keep me safer than she could. But she called twice a day, and her voice had become my anchor to normalcy in a world that had suddenly become surreal and dangerous. Dr. Marcus Bennett visited me at the safe house 3 days after my release from the hospital, bringing with him a briefcase full of medical files and a determination I hadn't seen before. He'd requested permission to continue my treatment in this unconventional setting, and I suspected his motivations went beyond mere professional duty. "How are you feeling physically?" he asked, settling into the living room's overstuffed armchair while I curled up on the sofa with a cup of tea that I'd watched Officer Martinez prepare from start to finish. "Stronger every day," I admitted. "The dizziness is almost completely gone, and I can walk without feeling like the ground is shifting under my feet." "That's excellent progress." The chelation therapy was very effective. Dr. Bennett opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "But I wanted to talk to you about something else today, something that might help other women in similar situations." I set down my tea, suddenly alert. "What do you mean?" "Natalie, your case isn't unique. Domestic poisoning is far more common than most people realize, and it's often misdiagnosed or never detected at all. I've been researching the phenomenon since we discovered what Derek was doing to you, and I think we might be able to prevent other women from going through what you experienced." Dr. Bennett spread several medical journals and research papers across the coffee table between us. The titles were sobering: Undetected Domestic Poisoning, A Silent Epidemic, Medical Gaslighting and Intimate Partner Violence, When Love Becomes Lethal, Recognizing Chemical Abuse. "There's a pattern," he continued, pointing to highlighted sections in the papers. "The victims are usually women between 25 and 45, married or in long-term relationships with men who appear devoted and concerned about their health. The symptoms develop gradually, mimicking common medical conditions like anxiety, menopause, or autoimmune disorders." As I read through the research, I began to see my own story reflected in case study after case study. Women who'd been dismissed by doctors, whose husbands had been praised for their dedication and support, who died from mysterious illnesses that were only later identified as deliberate poisoning. "How many women are we talking about?" I asked quietly. "We don't know for sure, because so many cases go undetected. But conservative estimates suggest hundreds of women die each year from domestic poisoning that's never identified as such. They're listed as natural deaths, medical mysteries, tragic accidents." The weight of that knowledge settled over me like a heavy blanket. Hundreds of women, hundreds of families destroyed by men who wore masks of love while administering death in small, careful doses. "What can we do about it?" Dr. Bennett leaned forward, his eyes bright with the fervor of someone who'd found a mission worth fighting for. "We can educate medical professionals to recognize the signs. We can develop screening protocols for emergency departments and primary care offices. We can create awareness campaigns that help women understand when to be suspicious of their own symptoms." Over the following weeks, as the investigation into Derek's crimes continued and the search for his whereabouts expanded to neighboring states, I found myself drawn deeper into Dr. Bennett's research. The safe house became our unofficial headquarters, where we spread out medical journals, court documents, and case files, building a comprehensive understanding of how domestic poisoners operated. Officer Martinez proved to be an unexpected ally in our research efforts. She'd been working domestic violence cases for over a decade and had seen patterns that medical professionals often missed. The control aspect is crucial, she explained during one of our evening discussions. These men don't just want to kill their wives. They want to control every aspect of the dying process. They want to be seen as devoted caregivers while they're actually orchestrating their victim's decline. I thought about Derek's behavior during my illness, how he'd insisted on making my coffee every morning, how he'd been so attentive about my vitamins, how he'd encouraged me to rest instead of going out with friends. Every gesture of care had been a calculated step in my murder. It's the perfect crime, I realized aloud. They get sympathy for being devoted husbands dealing with their wives' mysterious illnesses. They collect life insurance when we die, and nobody ever suspects them because they appear to be grieving widowers. Dr. Bennett nodded grimly. And even when suspicions are raised, the poisoning has often gone on for so long that the evidence is difficult to interpret. Chronic low-level exposure to toxins can mimic so many other conditions that even forensic pathologists miss it. Our research led us to contact other survivors, women who'd escaped domestic poisoning attempts, or who'd been fortunate enough to have doctors who recognized the signs early. Each story was heartbreakingly similar, yet uniquely terrifying in its details. There was Helen from Sacramento, whose husband had been adding small amounts of rat poison to her morning orange juice for 6 months. She'd survived only because a suspicious emergency room doctor had ordered toxicology screening when her symptoms didn't match any known medical condition. Maria from Phoenix had endured 2 years of systematic arsenic poisoning before a routine hair test revealed the truth. Her husband had been grinding up ant killer and mixing it into her nightly protein shakes, all while taking her to multiple specialists who couldn't explain her progressive neurological symptoms. Jennifer from Atlanta had nearly died from antifreeze poisoning, administered through contaminated wine that her husband had been serving during their romantic dinner dates. She'd been in a coma for 3 days before doctors discovered the ethylene glycol in her system. Each woman's story reinforced the same terrible pattern: devoted husbands, mysterious illnesses, medical professionals who focused on treating symptoms rather than questioning causes, and near-death experiences that could have been prevented with earlier recognition of the crime being committed. We need to do something bigger than research papers, I told Dr. Bennett during our 4th week at the safe house. We need to reach women directly, help them recognize when they might be in danger. What did you have in mind? I'd been thinking about this for days, lying awake in the safe house's guest room, staring at the ceiling and processing everything I'd learned about domestic poisoning and the women who'd suffered through it. A foundation, I said. Something that provides education, supports research, and helps women who suspect they're being poisoned get the medical testing they need. Dr. Bennett's eyes lit up with interest. That's ambitious. It would require significant funding, legal expertise, medical partnerships. I'll have life insurance money once Derek is caught and convicted, I pointed out. The policies he took out on me, they'll be voided due to his criminal intent. But our original policies are still valid. And I'm planning to divorce him, which means I'll be entitled to half of our assets. Officer Martinez looked up from the police report she'd been reviewing. You'd use the money he tried to kill you for to save other women from the same fate? That's poetic justice if I've ever heard it. The idea grew stronger with each passing day. I began sketching out plans for the foundation, researching the legal requirements for nonprofit organizations, and identifying potential medical partners who might help us develop better screening protocols. Grace drove down from Portland every weekend to help with the planning, bringing her expertise in business administration and her unwavering support for my newfound sense of purpose. I've never seen you like this, she observed during one of our planning sessions. Even before Derek, you always let other people take the lead. Now you're ready to change the world. She was right. The woman who'd been married to Derek Hayes had been accommodating, deferential, eager to avoid conflict. But that woman had been slowly poisoned into submission, her natural strength suppressed by toxins and psychological manipulation. As my body cleared the last traces of ethylene glycol, my mind was also clearing, revealing a determination I'd never known I possessed. The breakthrough in Derek's case came on a rainy Thursday morning in November. Detective Coleman arrived at the safe house with news that would change everything. "We found him," he announced without preamble. "Derek was arrested last night in a motel outside Phoenix. He was traveling under a false identity, but his fingerprints gave him away when he was picked up for a traffic violation." The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by a surge of something that felt like hunger. Not for food, but for justice. For the chance to face the man who tried to erase me from existence. "When will he be extradited back to Oregon?" I asked. "The process will take a few weeks, but he'll be back in Cedar Falls before Christmas. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "The trial will be intense, and Derek's defense attorney will likely try to paint you as an unstable wife with a history of medical problems." I thought about the months of systematic poisoning, the careful planning, the insurance policies and secret affair. I thought about all the other women who hadn't been as fortunate as I was, who'd died from mysterious illnesses while their husbands collected sympathy and insurance money. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. Dr. Bennett had been quietly working on his own project during the weeks we'd spent researching domestic poisoning. He'd been collaborating with toxicologists, emergency medicine physicians, and forensic pathologists to develop a screening protocol that could help medical professionals identify potential poisoning cases earlier. "I want to publish our research," he told me one evening as we reviewed the latest draft of his paper. "With your permission, I'd like to include your case as the primary example of how these crimes can be detected and prosecuted." The thought of my story being published in medical journals, of doctors around the country learning to recognize the signs Derek had hidden so well, filled me with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. "Use whatever you need," I said. "If it helps save other women, then everything I went through will have meant something." The foundation was becoming more than just an idea. Grace had connected me with a nonprofit attorney who specialized in victim advocacy organizations, and we'd begun the formal process of establishing the Emma Hayes Foundation for Domestic Poisoning Awareness. The name felt right, not because I wanted my story to be the center of attention, but because I wanted other women to know that survival was possible, that the strength to fight back could emerge from the most desperate circumstances. Dr. Bennett introduced me to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a toxicologist from Portland who'd been studying domestic poisoning for years. She became our first official medical advisor, bringing with her decades of expertise and a network of researchers who were eager to contribute to our mission. The medical community has been slow to recognize domestic poisoning as a significant public health issue, Dr. Rodriguez explained during our first formal meeting. "Part of the problem is that we're taught to look for medical explanations for symptoms, not criminal ones. We need to change that mindset." She showed me statistics that were both encouraging and terrifying. Medical awareness of domestic poisoning had increased significantly in recent years, leading to more cases being detected and prosecuted. But for every case that was identified, researchers estimated that dozens more went unrecognized. "Your foundation could be the catalyst for real change," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Medical education, public awareness, research funding, all of these things working together could save hundreds of lives." As autumn gave way to winter, I found myself transformed not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The woman who'd trusted Derek completely, who'd accepted his explanations and excuses without question, had been replaced by someone who questioned everything and trusted her own instincts above all else. Officer Martinez noticed the change during one of our regular check-ins. "You carry yourself differently now," she observed. "More confident, more aware of your surroundings." She was right. I'd learned to pay attention to details I'd previously ignored, to trust the little voice in my head that whispered warnings, to value my own perceptions even when others tried to dismiss them. The safe house had become more than just a refuge. It had become the birthplace of a new version of myself. Within its protected walls, surrounded by people who believed my story and supported my mission, I'd discovered strengths I'd never known I possessed. Dr. Bennett had become more than just my physician. He'd become a true partner in our shared mission to protect other women from the horrors I'd experienced. Our professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, built on mutual respect and a common purpose that felt unshakable. "I want you to know," he told me one evening as we finalized the Foundation's mission statement, "that working with you on this has changed how I practice medicine. I'll never again dismiss a patient's concerns about their symptoms, Never again assume that mysterious illnesses have purely medical explanations. The Foundation's first major initiative would be the development of a domestic poisoning screening tool for medical professionals, a simple questionnaire that could help doctors identify patients who might be victims of chemical abuse. Dr. Rodriguez was leading the research, working with emergency departments in 3 states to test the effectiveness of early intervention protocols. Our second initiative focused on public education, creating materials that could help women recognize the warning signs of domestic poisoning and know where to turn for help. Grace was coordinating this effort, using her business background to develop marketing strategies that could reach women in abusive relationships. The third initiative was the most personal, providing financial assistance for toxicology testing for women who suspected they were being poisoned. Many of the specialized tests needed to detect domestic poisoning weren't covered by insurance, and women in abusive relationships often didn't have access to the funds needed for comprehensive screening. This is where Derek's insurance money will make the biggest difference, I explained to our attorney during one of our planning meetings. Every woman who gets tested because of our financial assistance program is a potential life saved. As Derek's extradition date approached, I found myself preparing not just for the legal battle ahead, but for the confrontation with the man who tried to erase me from existence. The woman he'd been poisoning was gone forever, replaced by someone he'd never met before, someone who understood her own worth and refused to be diminished by anyone else's cruelty. Detective Coleman arranged for me to review the evidence that would be presented at Derek's trial, preparing me for the difficult process of testifying about my own attempted murder. The photographs of his makeshift laboratory, the contaminated vitamins, the insurance policies, and love letters to his girlfriend, all of it would be laid bare in open court. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Grace asked me the night before Derek was scheduled to arrive back in Cedar Falls. Seeing him again, hearing his voice, dealing with his attorney's attempts to discredit you, it's going to be brutal. I looked around the safe house that had become my sanctuary, at the research papers and foundation documents that represented my new purpose, at the people who'd helped me transform from victim to survivor to advocate. "I'm not the same woman he tried to kill," I said quietly. "He's going to discover that the hard way." The woman Derek Hayes had married might have been destroyed by his betrayal and cruelty, but the woman who would face him in court had been forged in the fire of that destruction, tempered by knowledge and strengthened by purpose. I was ready to look my would-be murderer in the eye and show him exactly what he'd failed to destroy. The courtroom felt smaller than I'd expected when I walked in for Derek's arraignment on a cold December morning. Cedar Falls County Courthouse was an imposing brick building that had seen decades of human drama, but today it would witness something particularly twisted, a wife confronting the husband who'd spent months slowly poisoning her to death. Derek sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow and his eyes seem smaller than I remembered. When he turned to look at me entering the gallery, I saw a flicker of the old Derek, the charming man who'd swept me off my feet 6 years ago, but it was quickly replaced by something calculating and cold. His attorney, Jonathan Marsh, was a sharp-dressed man in his 50s, who'd built his reputation defending white-collar criminals and domestic violence cases. Detective Coleman had warned me that Marsh was skilled at painting victims as unstable, vindictive women seeking attention or revenge. District Attorney Patricia Wong stood to present the charges: attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and insurance fraud. Each count carried significant prison time, and when combined, Derek was facing the possibility of life behind bars. "Your Honor," Marsh said when it was his turn to speak, "my client pleads not guilty to all charges. Mr. Hayes is a respected businessman in this community who's being accused of an elaborate crime based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of an estranged wife with a documented history of medical complaints." The phrase, "documented history of medical complaints," hit me like a slap. They were going to use my months of genuine symptoms Derek had caused, as evidence that I was a hypochondriac or attention seeker. Judge Catherine Mills, a stern woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, set the trial date for March. "Mr. Hayes, you're being held without bail due to the flight risk you've already demonstrated. This court will reconvene in 3 months. As Derek was led away, he turned to look at me one more time, His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he still believed he could manipulate the situation, that the woman he'd tried to kill would somehow save him from the consequences of his actions. That afternoon, District Attorney Wong met with me in her office to prepare for what she described as one of the most challenging cases she'd ever prosecuted. Domestic poisoning cases are notoriously difficult to win, she explained, spreading Derek's case file across her desk. The timeline is long, the evidence is largely scientific, and juries sometimes struggle to believe that someone could be so methodical in their cruelty. She showed me the prosecution's strategy, built around drive, Bennett's medical testimony, the physical evidence found in Derek's workshop, and the digital trail of his research into undetectable poisons. But the centerpiece would be my testimony about the systematic deterioration of my health and Derek's calculated responses to my illness. Marsh will try to discredit you, Wong warned. He'll suggest you're an unstable woman who fabricated this entire scenario to get revenge on an unfaithful husband. He'll point out that Derek never prevented you from seeing doctors, never tried to stop the medical investigations that ultimately exposed his crime. Because he thought he was smarter than the doctors, I replied. He believed he'd chosen a poison that would never be detected, a method that would make my death look natural. Exactly. And that arrogance is what will convict him. But you need to be prepared for Marsh to attack your credibility, your mental state, your motives. He'll make this trial as much about your character as Derek's crimes. Over the winter months, as the trial date approached, I threw myself into the Foundation's work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. The Emma Hayes Foundation had received its nonprofit status and was already making a difference in women's lives. Our first major success came when a woman in Seattle recognized the warning signs of domestic poisoning after reading our educational materials online. Jennifer Walsh had been experiencing mysterious neurological symptoms for months, while her husband lovingly cared for her and insisted she see specialist after specialist. But something about our description of the pattern made her suspicious enough to request independent toxicology testing. The tests revealed mercury poisoning from contaminated supplements her husband had been giving her. He was arrested before he could complete his murder plan, and Jennifer credited our foundation with saving her life. This is why we're doing all of this, I told Dr. Bennett when he brought me the news. Every woman who recognizes the signs, every life we save, it makes everything Derek put me through worthwhile. Dr. Bennett had become my closest ally, and, if I was honest with myself, something more. Our professional relationship had evolved into a deep friendship, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. He'd stood by me through the darkest period of my life, and now he was helping me transform that darkness into something that could illuminate the dangers other women faced. The Foundation has received an inquiry from the Department of Justice, he told me during one of our weekly meetings. They want to fund a national study on domestic poisoning based on our research. It could provide the data we need to change medical education standards across the country. The federal government's interest in our work validated everything we'd been trying to accomplish. But more importantly, it meant that Derek's crime would contribute to preventing similar crimes across the nation. Grace had moved to Cedar Falls temporarily to help coordinate the Foundation's rapid growth and to support me through the approaching trial. Her presence was a reminder of the family bonds that Derek had tried to sever along with my life. You're not the same person he married, Grace observed one evening as we reviewed my testimony for the 100th time. The woman he tried to kill was passive, eager to please, willing to accept his explanations for everything. The woman who's going to testify against him is none of those things. She was right. The months of recovery and advocacy work had transformed me in ways that went far beyond physical healing. I had learned to trust my instincts, to question authority when necessary, to stand up for myself and others who couldn't yet find their own voices. The Foundation's work had also brought me into contact with other survivors of domestic poisoning, and their stories reinforced my determination to see Derek convicted. Each woman I spoke with had endured similar patterns of manipulation, gaslighting, and systematic poisoning disguised as loving care. There was Margaret from Denver, whose husband had been adding antifreeze to her coffee for over a year before a perceptive emergency room doctor ordered the right tests. She'd survived, but suffered permanent kidney damage that would affect her for the rest of her life. Helen from Boston had been poisoned with arsenic administered through her daily vitamins. Just like me, but with a different toxin. Her husband had actually accompanied her to multiple medical appointments, playing the role of concerned spouse, while secretly documenting her declining health for insurance purposes. Carol from Miami had nearly died from thallium poisoning before a suspicious toxicologist at the hospital where she was admitted recognized the symptoms. Her husband had been researching her murder for over 2 years, meticulously planning every detail of what he intended to look like a tragic natural death. Each story strengthened my resolve to ensure that Derek faced the full consequences of his actions. These women deserved justice, and the women who might become victims in the future deserved protection. 2 weeks before the trial, I received an unexpected visitor at the Foundation's new offices in downtown Cedar Falls. Crystal Martinez, Derek's girlfriend, appeared at our reception desk, looking nervous and ashamed. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "About Derek. About what he told me." We met in the small conference room where Grace and I had been working on Foundation business. Crystal was younger than I'd expected, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested she worked in Derek's professional circle. "I didn't know," she began, her voice shaking. "About the poisoning, I mean. I knew he was planning to leave you, that he'd taken out life insurance, but I thought you had some kind of terminal illness." The revelation that Derek had lied to his girlfriend about my condition shouldn't have surprised me, but it added another layer to his deception that was somehow more disturbing than the attempted murder itself. "What exactly did he tell you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the anger building in my chest. "He said you had early onset dementia, that you were deteriorating rapidly and probably wouldn't live much longer. He said the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with you, that you were suffering and would be better off. I never imagined he was causing your symptoms." Crystal pulled out her phone and showed me text messages between herself and Derek, conversations that revealed the full scope of his manipulation. He'd convinced her that he was trapped in a marriage to a dying woman, that he was staying out of compassion and duty rather than love. "He talked about your episodes like they were heartbreaking to watch," Crystal continued. "He said you'd become confused and dizzy, that you couldn't function normally anymore. I felt sorry for both of you." The psychological manipulation was staggering. Derek hadn't just been poisoning my body. He'd been poisoning everyone's perception of our relationship, creating a narrative where he was the devoted husband caring for his tragically ill wife. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because when I heard about the charges, when I realized what he'd actually been doing to you, I knew I had to make it right. I have copies of all our conversations, including ones where he talked about the insurance money and what we'd do after you died." Crystal's testimony would be devastating to Derek's defense. Here was his girlfriend, the woman he'd been planning to build a new life with, confirming that he'd been anticipating my death and making plans based on collecting insurance money. District Attorney Wong was thrilled when I brought Crystal's evidence to her attention. "This destroys any possibility that Derek can claim he was trying to help you or that your illness was naturally occurring. His own girlfriend will testify that he was planning for your death and looking forward to the financial benefits." The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Dr. Rodriguez had been analyzing the contaminated vitamins found in Derek's workshop, and her detailed chemical analysis revealed something that made the case even stronger. The concentration of ethylene glycol in these pills was carefully calculated, she explained during a meeting at the district attorney's office. This wasn't random or haphazard. Whoever prepared these knew exactly how much poison would cause progressive symptoms without triggering immediate medical suspicion. Her analysis showed that Derek had been increasing the dosage gradually over time, ensuring that my symptoms would worsen at a steady pace that would mimic the progression of a natural degenerative disease. "He was basically titrating the poison like a medication," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "This level of precision requires significant research and planning. It's proof of premeditation in its most calculated form." As the trial date approached, I found myself experiencing a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I wanted Derek to face justice for what he'd done to me and what he'd planned to do to Crystal and any future victims. But I also knew that testifying would require me to relive the months of systematic poisoning, the gradual erosion of my health and independence, the psychological torture of being gaslit by the person who was supposed to love and protect me. Dr. Bennett had arranged for a therapist to help me prepare for the emotional impact of the trial. Dr. Susan Clark specialized in trauma therapy for victims of domestic violence, and she helped me understand that my desire for justice was healthy and appropriate. You're not seeking revenge, Dr. Clark assured me. You're seeking accountability. There's a crucial difference. Revenge is about causing pain. Accountability is about acknowledging truth and preventing future harm. Her words resonated with me as I practiced my testimony one final time. This wasn't about destroying Derek out of spite or anger. This was about ensuring that the truth was heard, that justice was served, and that other women would be protected from similar predators. The night before the trial began, Grace and I sat in my apartment reviewing everything one more time. The Foundation's work continued to grow, with new cases being reported every week and medical professionals across the country beginning to recognize the signs of domestic poisoning. Whatever happens in that courtroom, Grace said, you've already won. You survived his attempt to kill you, you've built something meaningful from the wreckage, and you've become someone he never expected you to be. She was right. The woman Derek had tried to murder no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, more aware, more determined to fight for herself and others. Tomorrow, I would face the man who'd betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, and I would do it with the knowledge that I'd already reclaimed my life from his attempts to destroy it. The Foundation's work would continue, regardless of the trial's outcome. Women would continue to be educated about the warning signs of domestic poisoning. Medical professionals would continue to receive training on recognition and intervention, and survivors would continue to find support and resources for their recovery. But tomorrow, in a Cedar Falls courtroom, Derek would finally be forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He would face the woman he'd tried to erase, the evidence he'd thought would never be discovered, and the justice he'd believed he was too clever to face. I went to sleep that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in over a year. Not because the trial would be easy, but because I knew I was ready for whatever Derek and his attorney tried to throw at me. The woman who would testify tomorrow had been forged in the crucible of his betrayal, and she was stronger than he could possibly imagine. The morning of my testimony dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of March sunshine that promised spring was finally displacing winter's grip on Cedar Falls. I stood before the mirror in my hotel room, adjusting the navy blue suit I'd chosen for this moment. Professional but not severe. Confident but not aggressive. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the confused, dizzy patient who'd collapsed in Riverside Medical Center's hallway 6 months ago. Grace knocked softly on my door. Ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, checking my appearance one final time. Thank you for being here through all of this. Wild horses couldn't keep me away from watching Derek get what he deserves. The courthouse was buzzing with activity when we arrived. Media vans lined the street outside, their crews setting up for what had become a high-profile case. Domestic poisoning was rare enough that Derek's trial had attracted national attention, with reporters from true crime shows and legal commentators eager to cover what prosecutors were calling one of the most methodical attempted murders they'd ever seen. District Attorney Wong met us at the courthouse entrance, her expression focused and determined. Are you feeling prepared, Natalie? More than prepared. I'm ready to tell the truth about what Derek did to me. Inside the courtroom, the gallery was packed with spectators, journalists, and other domestic violence advocates who'd come to support my testimony. I spotted several women I'd met through the Foundation's work, survivors who understood exactly what I'd endured, and what this trial meant for future victims. Derek sat at the defendant's table wearing an expensive gray suit that his parents had probably purchased for him. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, and there was a nervous energy about him that suggested the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. When his eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw none of the arrogance that had characterized his behavior during our marriage. Instead, there was something that looked almost like fear. Judge Mills called the court to order, and District Attorney Wong rose to deliver her opening statement. She laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision, describing Derek's systematic poisoning campaign as a cold-blooded murder plot disguised as marital devotion. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear evidence that the defendant spent months researching how to kill his wife slowly and undetectably. You will see the makeshift laboratory he created in their basement, the contaminated vitamins he prepared with scientific precision, and the insurance policies he purchased to profit from her death. This is not a crime of passion. This is premeditated murder carried out with patience and calculation. Attorney Marsh's opening statement attempted to paint Derek as a loving husband whose wife had become paranoid and vindictive after discovering his affair. My client made mistakes in his marriage, yes. He was unfaithful, and that was wrong. But infidelity is not attempted murder. The prosecution wants you to believe that a respected businessman spent months poisoning his wife based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a woman who has every reason to want revenge. When my name was called to testify, I stood and walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The courtroom fell silent as I was sworn in, and I could feel Derek's eyes on me throughout the process. But when I looked at him directly, he was the one who looked away first. District Attorney Wong began with gentle questions about my marriage to Derek, establishing the timeline of our relationship and the gradual onset of my symptoms. I described the early months of my illness in detail, the dizziness, the balance problems, the growing sense that something was terribly wrong with my body. "Can you tell the jury about your husband's response to your illness?" Wong asked. Initially, Derek was dismissive. He suggested my symptoms were stress-related, or that I was being dramatic. But then he became very involved in my medical care. He insisted on buying my vitamins, making my coffee every morning, preparing special meals to help with my energy levels. How did you feel about his increased attention to your health? At first, I was grateful. I thought he was finally taking my illness seriously and wanted to help me get better. I had no idea he was actually making me sicker. Wong guided me through the discovery of Derek's poisoning plot, from Dr. Bennett's suspicions to the blood test results that confirmed ethylene glycol in my system. I described the shock of learning that the vitamins Derek had been giving me were contaminated, the realization that his loving gestures had been attempts to kill me. "Mrs. Hayes, when you learned that your husband had been poisoning you, what was your emotional response?" Disbelief at first, then terror. The man I'd trusted with my life, who'd promised to love and protect me, had been systematically trying to end my life. Every act of care had been an act of violence. When Marsh began his cross-examination, his strategy became immediately clear. He questioned my memory of events, suggesting that the poisoning had affected my cognitive function and made me an unreliable witness. He implied that I'd concocted the entire story to get revenge on Derek for his affair with Crystal. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that you discovered your husband's infidelity before you went to Dr. Bennett with your suspicions about poisoning?" "No, that's not accurate. I learned about the affair after the poisoning was discovered." "But you were aware that your marriage was in trouble, weren't you? Your husband was distant, working late frequently, showing signs of wanting to end the relationship." "I knew Derek was pulling away, yes, but I never imagined he was trying to kill me." Marsh spent an hour trying to discredit my testimony, but his questions only served to highlight the thoroughness of the investigation and the overwhelming evidence against Derek. When he asked about my mental state during the months of poisoning, I was ready with an answer that clearly resonated with the jury. "Mr. Marsh, when someone is slowly poisoning you, it affects every aspect of your thinking and perception. But the one thing it doesn't affect is your memory of being poisoned. Every contaminated vitamin, every cup of coffee, every meal Derek prepared with such care. I remember all of it because those were the moments when he was trying to murder me." Dr. Bennett's testimony was devastating to Derek's defense. He explained the medical evidence with clear scientific precision, walking the jury through the process of how ethylene glycol poisoning works and why Derek's method was so insidious. "The defendant chose a poison that mimics common medical conditions," Dr. Bennett testified. "Ethylene glycol poisoning presents with symptoms that could be attributed to inner ear problems, anxiety, autoimmune disorders, or dozens of other conditions. It was a nearly perfect crime, except for one thing: the defendant underestimated his wife's determination to find answers." Dr. Rodriguez's testimony about the contaminated vitamins provided the scientific proof of Derek's guilt. Her analysis showed that the pills had been carefully prepared with increasing concentrations of poison designed to gradually worsen my symptoms over time. "This level of precision requires extensive research and planning," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The defendant didn't just decide one day to poison his wife. He studied the effects of ethylene glycol, calculated dosages, and prepared each contaminated pill with the goal of causing a slow, seemingly natural death." Crystal Martinez's testimony was perhaps the most damaging to Derek's case. She described their relationship, the lies Derek had told her about my health, and his plans for their future together funded by my life insurance money. He told me Natalie was dying from some kind of brain disease, Crystal testified, her voice barely above a whisper. He said she was suffering, and that it would be a mercy when she finally passed away. He talked about the insurance money like it was already his. When Derek took the stand in his own defense, his attorney tried to present him as a man who'd made mistakes but wasn't a killer. Derek denied poisoning me, claiming that someone else must have contaminated the vitamins, or that the whole thing was an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by his vindictive wife. But Derek's arrogance ultimately proved to be his downfall. When District Attorney Wong cross-examined him, he became defensive and angry, revealing flashes of the controlling, manipulative personality that had driven him to attempt murder. Mr. Hayes, you testified that you loved your wife. Is that why you took out a $500,000 life insurance policy on her without discussing it with her first? That was financial planning. Responsible spouses carry life insurance. And is that why you were researching undetectable poisons on your computer while your wife was getting sicker and sicker? I never researched poisons. That evidence was fabricated. So the Cedar Falls Police Department fabricated your browser history? They created fake evidence just to frame you for attempted murder? Derek's answers became increasingly erratic and defensive, and by the time Wong finished with him, even his own attorney looked defeated. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. When the foreman stood to announce that Derek had been found guilty on all counts, I felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over me. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Derek would never be able to hurt another woman the way he'd hurt me. Judge Mills sentenced Derek to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crime, quote, one of the most calculated and cold-blooded attempts at murder this court has ever seen. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one final time, and I met his gaze steadily. The woman he was looking at bore no resemblance to the victim he'd tried to create. After the trial, the Emma Hayes Foundation exploded in growth and recognition. The media coverage of Derek's case had brought national attention to the issue of domestic poisoning, and women across the country were reaching out for help, education, and support. Dr. Bennett and I appeared on national television programs, sharing our story and educating the public about the warning signs of chemical abuse. Medical schools began incorporating domestic poisoning awareness into their curricula, and emergency departments started using our screening protocols to identify potential victims. The Department of Justice funded our national research study, which revealed that domestic poisoning was far more common than anyone had realized. Our findings led to changes in how insurance companies investigated suspicious deaths, and how law enforcement approached cases involving mysterious illnesses in married women. 6 months after Derek's conviction, Dr. Bennett and I stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Foundation's new research facility. The building would house laboratories, counseling services, and educational programs designed to prevent other women from suffering what I'd endured. This all started with your refusal to accept easy answers about your symptoms, Dr. Bennett said as we watched researchers beginning their work in the new facility. If you hadn't pushed for more testing, if you hadn't trusted your instincts that something was wrong, Derek might have succeeded. And if you hadn't been willing to think beyond conventional medical explanations, we never would have discovered the truth, I replied. This foundation exists because we were both willing to ask difficult questions. Our professional partnership had evolved into something deeper over the months since Derek's arrest. Marcus Bennett had stood by me through the darkest period of my life, and our shared mission had created a bond that was both profound and unshakable. Natalie, he said quietly, taking my hand as we stood watching the sun set over Cedar Falls. I need you to know that working with you, building this foundation together, it's changed my life as much as it's changed the lives of the women we're helping. Mine too, I admitted. Derek tried to erase me, but instead he inadvertently created someone stronger than I ever knew I could be. The woman who'd married Derek Hayes had been trusting to a fault, eager to please, willing to accept explanations that didn't quite make sense. But the woman who stood in that courtroom and watched her would-be murderer sentenced to life in prison was someone entirely different, Someone who trusted her own instincts, who refused to be silenced or diminished, who used her trauma as a tool to protect others. Derek had spent months slowly poisoning my body, but he'd also unknowingly poisoned the version of myself that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation. The woman who emerged from his betrayal was immune to the kind of gaslighting and control that had nearly cost me my life. The foundation continued to grow, helping hundreds of women recognize the signs of domestic poisoning and get the medical testing they needed to confirm their suspicions. Each life saved, each crime prevented, each woman empowered to trust her own instincts was a victory against the kind of evil Derek represented. As I looked around at the research facility that bore my name, at the staff members who dedicated their careers to protecting vulnerable women, at the tangible proof that something beautiful could grow from even the darkest betrayal, I felt a sense of completion. Derek had tried to write the final chapter of my story, but instead, he'd only provided the catalyst for a new beginning that was entirely my own. The balance disorder that had brought me to Riverside Medical Center that day was gone, but it had been replaced by something far more valuable, a perfectly calibrated sense of my own worth, and the unshakable knowledge that I would never again allow anyone to diminish the woman I'd fought so hard to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.